Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Sharks trade board for this upcoming trade deadline, which is just over a month's time away. It is no secret to anyone around the league, as Mike Grier has indeed made it clear that the Sharks will be sellers at the upcoming trade deadline, and they've got multiple players who are on expiring contracts who are certainly in discussions, with one player in particular, of course, Timo Meier, who is potentially the most sought-after player around the entire league, not just on the San Jose Sharks, for a potential trade deal. And so in this video, we will be discussing not only what a potential return for said player could look like, but also the likelihood in which they will end up getting moved, in my opinion, of course. So let us start off immediately with Sharks goaltender James Reimer. Now, Reimer is a pretty good example of asset mismanagement from the San Jose Sharks. Reimer had signed a 2-year deal at the beginning of the 21-22 season, which was, of course, just last year. And over that year, he was putting up an extremely solid season on a relatively bad San Jose Sharks team. And so leading up to that year's trade deadline, so last year's trade deadline, Reimer was definitely a possible trade target, and the Sharks should have very likely moved on from him then and there, but maybe possibly certain teams were not willing to commit to a player who still had the 1 year left on his contract, and maybe the Sharks were just asking for a bit too much value, and so it never really materialized. However, at that year's entry draft, there was definitely another opportunity to move on from Reimer. Multiple teams were looking to shore up some of their goaltending, and Reimer is the real prime candidate to have been able to play a solid 30 games as a veteran backup who you're knowing what you're going to get from him, and could potentially even step into a starter role if there is some sort of injury right in front. And so the Sharks likely could have traded him at that point for potentially even like a 3rd round pick at the draft, and yet again it never really materialized, and it ends up in a situation where eventually Reimer's luck kind of ran out. It's very difficult to be a good goaltender on a bad team. When it comes to a forward, someone has to score the goals, and so while you might not be at your maximum potential, you're still able to put up a lot of points even if on a bad team. But as a goaltender, if the team in front of you isn't playing well, you need to play at like another level to be able to put up even pretty good stats, and Reimer has just not been able to do that this season. He is not been nearly as good, and his value has completely fallen off a cliff. And so while last year I think he probably could have gotten about a 3rd round pick, Reimer at this point might not even be worth much more than like a 5th round pick, and that's if the Sharks could even find a suitable trade partner. At the beginning of the season, I would have put his likelihood of being traded at like 7 on 10 at least. Now I have it down at a 4 on 10, where I certainly wouldn't be surprised to see Reimer move, but it is still quite likely, and I think even more likely than not, that Reimer ends up finishing out this season with the San Jose Sharks, and then some other team around the league takes like a league minimum contract type of deal with him, and he ends up with a completely different team. So again, a bit of asset mismanagement, certainly not a huge loss for the San Jose Sharks, but something that they could have gotten value out of that they just waited too long. Now let us move on to Nick Bonino, yet another expiring contract, kind of in a similar boat to Matt Nieto and then Andrew Cogliano last season. However, hopefully Bonino's upcoming trade, which is likely to happen, I imagine, will not go the same way as Matt Nieto, who was like sort of packaged with Ryan Merkley to get rid of him and didn't end up returning with any sort of draft pick. And it goes more so the way of Andrew Cogliano last year, where he was traded to the Colorado Avalanche, who ended up winning the Cup. So congratulations to Cogliano there, in exchange for a 5th round pick. Now for Nick Bonino, I imagine he will have a bit more value than Cogliano had. Nick Bonino has obviously won Stanley Cup with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Of course, we all remember in 2016 he was a part of the HBK line, which was such a huge issue for the San Jose Sharks in that 2016 Stanley Cup Finals. And Bonino also has, I feel, a bit more of an offensive upside than Cogliano. He's sitting currently at 9 goals, 8 assists for 17 points, which isn't great, but it's not terrible for a team's, let's say, fourth line, potentially could even flex up to the third line. Bonino is also, a very capable center to be able to play on one of these teams. He brings the leadership, all of those sort of off the ice type of characteristics that I'm sure many teams would be looking to take a chance on. And so I think as though instead of a 5th round pick like the Sharks got from Cogliano, they'll probably be able to get about a 4th. They might be able to squeeze up to a 3rd out of a team if they're desperate for this type of player and if the market is good for this type of player, but realistically I am expecting more so a 4th round pick. And in terms of the likelihood of him being traded, I have it at about an 8 on 10. I really do think the Sharks will do it for him because, of course, when it was trading Andrew Cogliano, it's not because the Sharks really needed the 5th round pick to squeeze every possible value out of every possible player, but it's also sort of like it's like a common courtesy almost, where you get rid of this player who is on a team that is clearly not going to make the playoffs to give them a chance to make something of this particular year. And as I mentioned, Cogliano did end up winning the cup that season, so Bonino likely sees that and says, hey, could I get traded to like a Boston or a Tampa or whoever, and the Sharks will likely end up doing that for him. I do think it's certainly possible he stays with the Sharks if the market isn't particularly good and no possible deal ends up popping up. Bonino might just stay a San Jose Shark, but I put it at an 8 on 10. But now let's get to the real meat and potatoes of this video, as we of course now have Timo Meier. Now I was considering filming this video yesterday, but I ended up putting it off until today, and I guess that ended up being a very good choice because just yesterday, later on in the day, we saw the Bo Horvat trade materialize. Horvat was traded from the Canucks to the Islanders in exchange for Anthony Beauvillier, Aatu Räty, as well as a protected 2023 first round pick, which in more general terms is a young middle six forward, a pretty solid, actually a good prospect from the Islanders, as well as a pretty high value first round pick, because I know a lot of people will hear, oh, I don't want a protected first round pick, and that is, a decent thought. But here's the thing with the New York Islanders is that if this ends up being a pick that is in the top 12, it is protected, and so it gets shifted to 2024 as an unprotected first round pick. And it is very possible that even with Bo Horvat, the Islanders will still miss the playoffs this season, which means it's very possible that this ends up being a top 12 pick, which means it's very possible it gets slided all the way to 2024 as an unprotected, and then of course it is very possible the Islanders miss the playoffs next season as well, and that means the Canucks could end up with a lottery pick from this deal. So this first round pick actually ends up holding a lot of value compared to, let's say, a playoff team's first round pick, which would end up being something like a 26th overall, more or less guaranteed. So this is not a bad draft pick for the Canucks to have picked up. Aatu Räty is also a very solid prospect around the NHL, certainly not like a top, I'm expecting him to be a first line center by next season type of prospect, but still a pretty good one. And Beauvillier is more so just like that young forward who could play like a second line role at best if things end up working out. So this is the type of package that we could sort of assume would be a baseline for Timo Meier. But maybe I'm a bit biased here, but it seems as though Meier would actually retain even more value than what Horvat currently has. The major advantage that Horvat has over Meier is that Horvat is a center, which is of course valued more than a winger, but that's really the only advantage I can think of. In terms of actual points production, while Horvat does currently hold more points and more goals than Meier, it's a bit of a precarious situation because Horvat's currently sitting on 31 goals with a 21.7% shooting percentage, which is massively inflated and is likely to fall back down to earth. If we take his amount of shots with, let's say, a 14% shooting percentage, which is still higher than Timo Meier, but more so in line with maybe his career average, he ends up with just 20 goals on the season. Meanwhile, Timo Meier, like I said, 28 goals, but he's got a much more realistic 12.3% shooting percentage, meaning you would expect that to be able to continue for the rest of this season. On top of that, Bo Horvat's prior career high in terms of points was only 61. That's pretty decent, but if we take a look at Timo Meier, who has been in the league for 2 less years, Meier has surpassed that point total twice, including last year by a pretty hefty margin. And so Meyer's also sort of, you're expecting him to be able to continue this pace more so than you might expect that from Bo Horvat. So I think Meyer definitely the more consistent player in that regard. And it is not just point production that would give Meyer more value, but also contract situation. Bo Horvat is pretty much a rental here for the New York Islanders. As much as they say, well, we do want to try and re-sign him, it is completely in Bo Horvat's hands, and especially if the Islanders miss the playoffs this season, who's to say Horvat would even want to re-sign with them? It's really not all that likely. Meanwhile, with Meyer, while a lot has been said about his $10 million qualifying offer, he is still technically a restricted free agent, so whatever team picks him up will be able to discuss a possible extension with him. And if they were going to want to give him an extension of, $8, likely even $9 million, they probably could afford to go slightly higher than that, as $10 million for 1 year if an extension can't be worked out, and then give them another full entire year to be able to find a common ground with Timo Meier for a possible contract extension. And that's just not a luxury that the Islanders would have with Bo Horvat. So Meier, a lot of possible value there, and even if the team that acquires him can't figure out a deal and isn't able to go for that $10 million qualifying offer, at the draft they could trade him to a team that could do that $10 million qualifying offer, and whatever team receives him would know that they would have Timo Meier for at least one full season, which again, the Islanders don't have that luxury with Horvat. So there's a lot of possible value and even higher value from Meier than what Horvat has. And so in terms of a possible deal, it should start at that baseline, which is actually a pretty decent baseline, but maybe even go higher than that. And so what is it that the Sharks could expect from a Timo Meier deal? If they want a roster player in return, they can get a pretty decent, though of course worse than Timo Meier, young player who is maybe more of like a third to flexing up to the second line. But they could also get a team's one of their better prospects, if not their best prospect from a playoff team, as well as a first and maybe even like a third or a second, or potentially if a team really wants to sweeten the pot and confirm that they can get Meier from the Sharks, they may even be able to get a couple of first-round picks from this deal. Meier really is such an elite player at this point, one of the better wingers in the league. I don't think it's crazy to say he's a top 20 winger in the league and can definitely push the needle forward for whichever team ends up acquiring him. He is that valuable. I think a team would be willing to maybe slightly overpay for Meier's services, especially if they're able to work out some sort of extension moving forward. And so this can be a real strong deal for the San Jose Sharks. Having said that, I made a video at the beginning of this season discussing whether or not the Sharks should trade Timo Meier, and my conclusion from that was that the Sharks should not trade him, and I haven't necessarily swayed from that particular point. I do still think with Meier, who will be 27 years old at the beginning of next season, I do think that his window of sort of being a very good player still lines up with what the Sharks could have as a competitive year, right? While the Sharks probably won't be very good next season either, it is technically possible that they could be a playoff team by the 24-25 season, depending on how this year and next year's draft actually goes for them. And at that point, Meier would only be 28 years old, which is still on the correct side of 30, especially when you compare to Tomas Hertl, who for whatever reason was given an over $8 million contract extension, when realistically he's only going to be, 31 years old by the time the Sharks could realistically be competitive again, which is of course on the wrong side of 30. So my logic was, if you gave Hertl a contract, why wouldn't you give Timo Meier one? But of course, it is different management. Hertl was signed by interim GM Joe Will. Now it is Mike Grier at the helm of the San Jose Sharks, so in the end we may very well see Meier traded, and I think it's actually quite likely we do. In terms of likelihood, I've given it a 9 on 10. I'm basically in a situation where every day I wake up and check Twitter to see if Meier had been dealt while I was sleeping. It really does feel at this point that it could come at any day, just as the Bo Horvat trade came very suddenly just last night. And so while when it came to Hertl last season, I was I knew that a trade could happen, but it never really felt super imminent. This Meier trade definitely feels at some point it will indeed happen. So while I don't think it's the full 10 on 10, I'm expecting Meier gone, pack his bags already. A 9 on 10, it does seem like Meier's time as a San Jose Shark is unfortunately coming to an end. And finally, on the trade board, we have Erik Karlsson. Did have to mention him because especially earlier on in the year, it felt as though he was getting a lot of trade talks. Seems to have slowed down as we approach the trade deadline, which is probably not a great sign as to whether or not he would actually end up getting moved. And that is exactly why I've given him a 2 on 10. At this point, when it came to Timo Meier, he's on an extremely reasonable contract that pretty much any team could pick up with just like slight amount retained on 1 year left on his deal, or maybe like a different player coming back the other way who is going to move out some money. But with Erik Karlsson, not only does he have an extremely less reasonable $11.5 million as a contract, but he's got multiple years left on it after this one, which means any sort of salary retention that the Sharks would do would be on the books for multiple years. And so working out a trade like this mid-season is incredibly difficult, as most teams do not really have the cap room to make something like this happen. So while an Erik Karlsson trade definitely could happen by the draft at the end of this season, it happening mid-season seems extremely unlikely. Not impossible, which is why I did not give it a 1 on 10, but I have given it that 2 on 10 because at this point I'd be insanely surprised if something got worked out there. And in terms of actual value, it is extremely difficult as well to evaluate what the Sharks in terms of assets can get back, because Karlsson has a ton of upside, but that contract also gives him a lot of downside, and so it'd be very much a big question of how much the other team's GM really values Karlsson. In terms of just like base as a player he would be able to get insane value. We're talking like a top prospect, a first round pick, multiple other assets in a deal like that. But the contract, and depending on how much the Sharks are actually willing to retain, that value drops and drops and drops, and it's very difficult to really predict where it lands. But at this point, we don't really need to, because like I said, I doubt a trade mid-season ends up happening. But that will do it for this trade board here for the San Jose Sharks. It is quite clear, like I said, that the Sharks will be sellers. Multiple players, I expect pretty much all of them almost, besides Karlsson, to be gone by the time the trade deadline comes and goes, and we'll see what type of assets the Sharks can get in return. Class dismissed.